The night Edward Hall finally found someone willing to save his crumbling empire, he walked into a ballroom and realized the person holding his future in her hands was the same woman he'd thrown out into the rain 5 years ago, with their son on her hip and one suitcase to her name. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us which city you're reading from. And when this story is over, rate it from 0 to 10. Follow the page so you never miss a story like this. Now settle in. This one will stay with you. The black Mercedes S-Class moved through the heart of Midtown Manhattan like a man returning to the scene of his own crime. Edward Hall, 44, sat in the back seat straightening his bow tie with the practiced calm of someone who had learned long ago never to let his hands show fear, even when they were shaking. Outside the tinted windows, the city moved the way it always did, relentless, indifferent, expensive, the kind of city that doesn't pause for billionaires and certainly doesn't pause for their regrets. The Ashford Grand Hotel rose ahead of him like a monument to everything he had built and was now about to lose. "Sir," his driver said, pulling beneath the gold canopy. "We've arrived." Edward stepped out. His 6'3" frame still commanded attention the way it always had. Broad shoulders, close-cut hair, the kind of jaw that photographed well on the cover of Forbes. His tuxedo was Brioni. His shoes were handmade in Florence. Every surface of him announced, "This man has won." But the slight tightness around his eyes told a different story. Hall Global Holdings, the empire he had built from nothing, the company that bore his name on 37 floors of prime Manhattan real estate, was 3 weeks from collapse. Bad debt, worse decisions, and a CFO he'd trusted with his life who had been quietly bleeding the company dry for years. Tonight was his last card. An anonymous multinational corporation had approached his board with a rescue acquisition. The deal was structured, the papers were drafted. All Edward had to do was walk in, shake hands with the mystery CEO, and accept the terms. He could buy back his dignity later. Tonight, he just needed to survive. He handed his invitation to the attendant at the entrance and stepped into the ballroom. The room was exactly the kind of room Edward had once owned. Crystal chandeliers threw warm gold light across tables of senators, hedge fund managers, tech founders, and foreign dignitaries. Champagne moved through the crowd on silver trays. Conversations hummed beneath a string quartet playing something none of them were actually listening to. Edward had attended 100 galas like this one. He had never attended one as a supplicant. He accepted a glass of champagne he didn't intend to drink and moved through the crowd, scanning faces, calculating alliances, doing what he had always done in rooms like this. Reading power. People noticed him. A few nodded. A few looked away too quickly. That was new. He had almost reached the far end of the room when the lights shifted. The quartet fell silent. A voice from the podium, smooth, practiced, the kind that fills a room without trying, announced that the evening's host would now be introduced. The crowd turned. Edward turned. A single spotlight descended onto the stage, and the champagne glass nearly slipped from his hand. She stood beneath the light, in a midnight blue gown that moved like water when she breathed. Her hair was swept back. Her posture was the kind you don't learn, the kind the world gives you only after it has tried and failed to break you. Diamond earrings caught the light. A slight smile played at the corner of her mouth as the room filled with applause. Not polite applause. The real kind. The kind a room gives someone it genuinely respects. Edward's chest stopped working properly. He knew that face. He had watched that face disappear through iron gates on a rainy Thursday night 5 years ago, while she clutched a 4-year-old boy to her chest and dragged a single suitcase through the mud. He had told himself she would be fine. He had told himself she needed to go. He had told himself a great many things on that night, standing behind glass while the storm erased her. He had not told himself this. Before we go on, drop a comment. Tell us where you're reading from. Rate this one from 0 to 10 when it's done. Follow the page. You don't want to miss what happens next. The chairman leaned toward the microphone with the reverence of a man introducing royalty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "it is my privilege to present the new chairwoman and controlling shareholder of Hall Global Holdings, Miss Flora Jones." The room erupted. Flora Jones, the woman Edward Hall had thrown out of his own home, the mother of his son, the woman he had publicly declared a liability, lifted one hand in gracious acknowledgement of a standing ovation from the most powerful people in Manhattan. And Edward Hall, billionaire, founder, architect of his own ruin, stood perfectly still in the middle of that glittering crowd, forgotten, peripheral, and completely alone. For the first time in his life, he was not the most powerful person in the room. He wasn't even close. 5 years ago, Edward Hall had believed that throwing Flora out would make him stronger. Tonight, watching her accept the applause of every person whose opinion had ever mattered to him, he understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the day he watched her walk away in the rain was not the day he saved his empire. It was the day he began to lose everything. He remembered it the way you remember a car accident, not in sequence, but in flashes. Sharp, irreversible. 5 years earlier, the Hall mansion sat on 4 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of property that made other wealthy men feel inadequate. 12 bedrooms, a private lake, iron gates that opened only when Edward decided they should. That Thursday night, they had opened for the last time. The board had been circling for weeks. A procurement scandal had broken in the financial press. Inflated contracts, offshore accounts, a paper trail that led dangerously close to Edward's signature. He hadn't known, or hadn't wanted to know. The distinction, he was learning, mattered very little to shareholders. Victor Kane had sat across from him in his study that afternoon, perfectly composed, a man who wore calm the way other men wore cologne. The board wants a scapegoat, Victor had said, turning a crystal glass slowly in his hand. Someone whose involvement with the financials looks suspicious. Someone close enough to you that the distance gives you cover. Edward had frowned. What are you suggesting? Victor had set the glass down carefully. Flora has been accessing the company's internal accounts, Edward. Transfers, records, things a wife has no business touching. He paused. I'm not saying she's guilty of anything. I'm saying the board won't care about the distinction. Edward should have asked more questions. He didn't. Flora found him in the study an hour later, a manila folder pressed to her chest, her eyes carrying the particular urgency of someone who had discovered something they couldn't unknow. Edward, I need you to look at these. She spread the documents across his desk. Account statements, wire transfers, internal memos routed through a shell company he didn't recognize. Something is wrong with the Meridian contracts. The numbers don't match. Someone has been... Where did you get these? From the shared financial server. Edward, listen to me. You've been going through company accounts. His voice dropped to the register Flora had learned to fear. Without my knowledge, without authorization. I'm your wife. You're a liability. The word left his mouth before he could dress it as anything else. The board already has questions about the finances, and now I find out you've been accessing restricted records. What am I supposed to tell them? Flora, that my wife has been running her own private investigation? I'm trying to protect you. Get out of my study. Edward, get out. The argument lasted 40 minutes. It felt like 40 years. She begged him to read the documents. He accused her of manufacturing a distraction. She wept. He hardened. She stopped weeping. That was the moment he should have paid attention to. When Flora Jones stopped crying and simply looked at him. Quietly. Completely. The way a person looks at something they are memorizing for the last time. He didn't notice. The storm had already started when she came downstairs with the suitcase. Ethan was on her hip, half asleep, his small face pressed into her neck. 4 years old. Too young to understand. Old enough to sense, somehow, that something was ending. Edward stood at the top of the stairs and said nothing. Flora crossed the marble foyer without looking back. The front door opened. Rain came in. She walked through it. The iron gates parted, then closed. Edward stood at the window and watched until the taillights of the taxi disappeared into the storm. He told himself he had made the right decision. He told himself she would be fine. He told himself a great many things that night, standing alone in a 12-bedroom house that had never, until that moment, felt quite so empty. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Newark that smelled like old carpet and other people's cooking. 1 bedroom. A window that faced a brick wall. A radiator that knocked through the night like something trapped inside it. Flora stood in the middle of it with Ethan on her hip and 1 suitcase at her feet and told herself, this is not the end. This is just the floor. The money ran out in 6 weeks. She had left the mansion with what was in her personal account. Enough, she thought, to buy herself time. What she hadn't accounted for was how expensive survival was when you were doing it alone. Rent, groceries, Ethan's daycare, the small, relentless costs of keeping a child safe in a world that didn't particularly care whether you managed it or not. She took the first consulting job she was offered, a mid-sized logistics firm hemorrhaging clients, needing someone to diagnose why. She worked their problem during the day and freelanced corporate restructuring briefs at night after Ethan was asleep, her laptop open on a kitchen table that wobbled unless you wedged a folded napkin under the left leg. She was exhausted in a way that had no name. She kept going anyway. What none of Edward's board members had ever understood, what Edward himself had never fully acknowledged, was that Flora Jones had always been the one thinking 3 moves ahead. The Singapore expansion that doubled Hall Global's revenue in 2017, Flora had drafted the market entry strategy on a legal pad during a transatlantic flight and slid it across the breakfast table one Tuesday morning. Edward had presented it to the board as his own thinking. She hadn't minded. She had believed then that his success was her success. The Meridian partnership that opened Hall Global's first African markets, Flora's contact, Flora's relationship, Flora's negotiation, conducted quietly over 8 months while Edward attended the press conferences. She had built half his empire from a position of deliberate invisibility. Now she was simply done being invisible. Within a year, she had 3 corporate clients. Within 2, she had incorporated Jones' strategic group and moved Ethan into a real bedroom with a window that faced actual sky. The clients came through referrals, one CFO to another, one boardroom to the next. Word traveled the way it always does in serious circles, quietly and with great conviction. She's the one you call when the problem is too complicated for the people you've already tried. She expanded into London, then Dubai, then Singapore, a city she already knew better than the people who'd been doing business there for decades. She began acquiring struggling companies, the way she had once acquired struggling divisions for Edward, identifying the hidden value, restructuring the core, and refusing to accept that broken things couldn't be made into something formidable. On a Tuesday morning in April, 5 years after walking through a storm with a suitcase and a sleeping child, Flora Jones sat at the head of a mahogany conference table on the 31st floor of a building she owned and signed the paperwork acquiring her 10th company. Her assistant slid the folder across. Flora uncapped her pen. She didn't hesitate. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered with the particular arrogance of a city that rewards only the relentless. Flora understood that city now. She had built herself in its image. The view from the 42nd floor had not changed. Manhattan still spread itself below like a circuit board lit from within, indifferent and eternal. Edward had stood at this window 1,000 times over 15 years and felt, each time, the particular satisfaction of a man surveying something he had conquered. He didn't feel that now. Now he felt the window for what it actually was. Glass. Thin. Breakable. The numbers had stopped making sense in January. Not because they were complicated. Edward had read financial reports in his sleep for 2 decades. They stopped making sense because the story they told was one he couldn't reconcile with the decisions he remembered making, or believed he had made. The Carlyle investment. His idea, Victor had said, presenting the proposal with the quiet confidence of a man delivering good news. $300 million into a private equity fund that had since dissolved into something no forensic accountant could fully explain. The Harmon Tower acquisition. Edward had signed the term sheet in a Lagos hotel room at 11 at night. Victor on the phone, walking him through the rationale point by point. The building was now the subject of 2 separate lawsuits and an SEC preliminary inquiry. 14 months of decisions, unwound on a spreadsheet, each one traceable back to a recommendation, a briefing, a phone call, all of them from Victor Kane. Edward sat at his desk and looked at the pattern for a long time. Then he looked at it again. Victor had arrived at Hall Global 11 years ago with a Harvard MBA, a handshake like a closing argument, and an instinct for making Edward feel that every good idea had already been his own. Edward had trusted him the way powerful men trust the people who reflect their power back at them, completely and without examination. He was beginning to understand what that had cost him. His assistant had stopped bringing good news because there was none to bring. The board had requested an emergency meeting. 2 senior partners had quietly retained outside counsel. The word restructuring was appearing in internal memos, with a frequency that made Edward's jaw tighten every time he saw it. Hall Global was not restructuring. Hall Global was drowning. He found the photographs on a Wednesday evening, clearing space in the credenza behind his desk for documents his lawyers needed. A white envelope, unmarked. Inside, a handful of photographs from what must have been Ethan's third birthday. Flora laughing at something off camera. Ethan, chocolate cake on his chin, holding up 3 fingers with tremendous seriousness. Edward standing slightly apart from them both, already somewhere else in his mind. He sat with the photographs for longer than he intended, put them in his breast pocket. Didn't examine why. The invitation arrived the following morning. Cream paper, embossed lettering. An exclusive black tie gala at the Ashford Grand, hosted by an unnamed multinational corporation announcing a major acquisition. His assistant had attached a note. Sources say it's a rescue package. Hall Global is on the short list. Edward read it twice. Then he reached for his phone and told his driver to block the evening. It was, as far as he could see, the last card he had left to play. The applause didn't stop. That was the thing Edward couldn't process, standing frozen at the edge of the crowd with a champagne glass he had forgotten he was holding. The applause kept going, genuine, sustained, the kind that fills a room from the floor up. And Flora stood at the podium and received it the way she received everything now, apparently, quietly, completely, as though she had always expected to end up exactly here. She looked like she belonged to a different world than the one he had thrown her out of. She looked like she owned this one. When the room finally settled, Flora spoke. Her voice was measured and precise. No performance in it, no theater, just clarity, which turned out to be more commanding than either. She spoke about the employees of Hall Global, the ones who had shown up every morning for years, doing their work faithfully, while the leadership above them made decisions that put everything they'd built at risk. She spoke about responsible acquisition, about what it meant to take on a company not as a trophy but as a trust. She did not mention Edward Hall by name. She didn't need to. Every person in that room understood exactly what she was doing and respected her more for the restraint. When she finished, the room rose. Edward did not. His legs had stopped receiving instructions from the rest of him. He watched a senator cross the room to shake her hand, watched a sovereign wealth fund director wait patiently for 3 minutes just to exchange a word with her, watched investors who had never once returned his calls in the last 8 months orbit her like she was the fixed point everything else organized itself around. This is what I threw away, some part of him thought, distantly, like a transmission from a place he'd buried. He approached her 20 minutes later, near the window overlooking the park, when the crowd around her had thinned enough to allow it. Flora, she turned, and that was the moment that undid him completely. Not anger in her eyes, not pain, not the satisfaction of a woman watching a man finally get what he deserved. Just a kind of clean, settled recognition. The way you look at someone who was once significant to your life and has since been reclassified into something much smaller. Edward, she extended her hand. It's good to see you well. A handshake. 5 years. A handshake. I didn't know, he started. I had no idea that you were... I'd imagine not. Her tone was not unkind. It was simply final. The verbal equivalent of a door that had been closed so long it had been painted over from the other side. A member of her team appeared at her elbow. She acknowledged him with a glance, then turned back to Edward with the particular efficiency of a woman whose time was now worth more than his entire remaining quarter. We'll schedule a formal transition meeting next week. My office will be in touch with yours. She adjusted the small clutch in her hand. But so there's no ambiguity going into that conversation. She held his gaze. Mr. Hall, from this moment forward, all major decisions require my approval. She moved past him to greet a waiting dignitary. Edward stood at the window alone, the city glittering below him, and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He started pulling records at 2 in the morning. Not because he had a plan, because he couldn't sleep, and because Flora's voice kept returning to him in the silence of his apartment. Not the Flora from tonight, composed and unreachable in midnight blue, but the Flora from 5 years ago, standing at his desk with a manila folder pressed to her chest, saying something is wrong with the Meridian contracts. He had thrown her out 3 hours later. He opened his laptop and began to read. It took him 4 days. 4 days of cross-referencing internal memos, wire transfer records, board meeting minutes, and the financial forensics report his lawyers had quietly commissioned 2 months ago, and which he had, until now, only skimmed. The Meridian Shell Company Flora had flagged wasn't a footnote. It was the architecture of everything. 12 years of carefully constructed misdirection, layered so deliberately that it had taken a collapsing empire and a forensic accountant with no loyalty to anyone to finally make the shape of it visible. Victor Kane had been extracting money from Hall Global since year 3. Not recklessly, precisely. The way a surgeon removes something slowly, in amounts small enough that the body doesn't register the loss until the damage is already irreparable. Inflated vendor contracts. Fabricated consulting fees routed through entities Victor controlled. Investment recommendations that benefited funds with no visible connection to him and every invisible one. $340 million. Over 12 years. Edward sat with that number for a long time. The fabricated evidence came last. Buried in a folder of HR compliance records from 2019, documents that had apparently been used to brief the board during the scandal, were 2 internal memos bearing Flora's name. Both suggested she had been accessing accounts without authorization. Both had been generated from Victor's assistant's workstation. Both were dated 3 days before Edward had confronted her. 3 days before he had called her a liability. 3 days before he had watched her walk out into the rain. Edward read the memos twice. Then he pushed his chair back from the desk and pressed both hands flat against his thighs and stared at the wall. Flora had come to him with the evidence of Victor's fraud. Victor had responded by manufacturing evidence against Flora. And Edward, certain of his own judgment, impatient with complication, unwilling to consider that the person he trusted in the boardroom might be less trustworthy than the person he trusted at home, had done exactly what Victor needed him to do. He had eliminated the one person who could have stopped all of it. He found the photographs again without meaning to. Ethan. 3 candles. Chocolate cake. He sat on the floor of his study. This man who owned buildings, who had appeared on the covers of magazines, who had never in his adult life allowed himself to be seen as anything less than in control. And he put his face in his hands. The sound that came out of him was not dignified. It didn't need to be. There was no one left to perform for. Flora had agreed to 1 hour. Her assistant had communicated the terms with the crisp neutrality of someone accustomed to managing complicated arrangements. Saturday afternoon, a neutral location, the sitting room of Flora's Upper East Side townhouse. Flora herself would not be present. The housekeeper would remain in the next room. 1 hour. Edward had said yes before the message finished loading. He arrived 7 minutes early and spent those 7 minutes on the sidewalk outside, doing something he hadn't done since the night his father died. He prayed, not formally. Just a quiet, internal acknowledgement that he was about to walk into a room where no amount of money, leverage, or practiced composure would be of any use to him whatsoever. The housekeeper led him to the sitting room and offered him tea he didn't drink. Then footsteps on the stairs. Small. Unhurried. Ethan walked in. 9 years old. Dark eyes. His mother's cheekbones and, with a precision that felt almost cruel, Edward's jawline in miniature. He wore a navy sweatshirt and gray joggers and looked at Edward the way children look at things they have thought about for a very long time, with a hunger that was trying very hard to appear casual. He stopped a few feet from the sofa. Edward stood. Neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have. Then Edward, billionaire, founder, architect of his own ruin, crouched down to his son's eye level the way you do when you understand, finally, that you are not the most important person in the room. Do you know who I am? Ethan looked at him steadily. You're my dad. 3 words. No accusation in them, no performance. Just a fact. The boy had apparently decided on long ago and saw no reason to complicate. Edward's throat closed entirely. They sat together on the sofa. Ethan did most of the talking, the way 9-year-olds do when they are nervous and covering it with information. His school, his football team, a book about space he had read 3 times, a loose tooth that was taking what he described as forever to come out. Edward listened with the complete attention of a man who understood he was being given something he had not earned. Then Ethan said, "Wait here," and disappeared upstairs. He returned carrying a shoebox. Inside, photographs. Some Edward recognized, some he didn't, which was worse. Birthday drawings addressed to Dad in the large, unsteady handwriting of a child who had not yet learned that some letters don't get answered. Cards for Christmases. A Father's Day card from 2 years ago, still in its envelope, never sent because there was no address to send it to. He had kept all of it. Every year, every occasion, every unanswered silence, he had kept all of it, and said nothing, and waited. Edward held a crayon drawing of two figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of a house with a yellow door. Underneath, in Ethan's handwriting, "Me and Dad." He couldn't speak. Ethan watched him carefully. Then, with the devastating simplicity that belongs only to children and the completely honest, "Why didn't you come back?" Edward looked at his son. His mouth opened. Nothing came, because there was no answer that was both true and survivable. Not in that room, not in front of those eyes, not holding a crayon drawing of a house with a yellow door that he had never walked back through. The question hung in the air between them like a sentence that would never, fully, be completed. The story broke on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, Victor Kane's name was on the front page of every financial publication that mattered, and Edward Hall's was directly beneath it. Not as victim, but as question mark. What did he know? When did he know it? The framing was already set before Edward's lawyers had finished their first cup of coffee. The board convened an emergency session that afternoon. Edward sat at the head of the table out of habit, though it was becoming clear that habit was the only authority he had left in that room. The strategy was simple, his general counsel explained. Distance, delegation, a carefully worded statement emphasizing that Edward had been misled by a trusted executive, that corrective measures were already underway, and that Hall Global remained committed to its stakeholders. Standard language, clean exits. The kind of statement that protected everyone by saying nothing true about anyone. Edward listened to the whole thing. Then he told them he'd think about it overnight. The shareholder meeting was Friday. Press conference immediately after. He sat in the back of his car outside the Midtown Conference Center for 4 minutes before going in, holding his phone, looking at a photograph Ethan's housekeeper had quietly forwarded him the previous evening. Ethan at his desk, doing homework, completely unaware of being observed. An ordinary 9-year-old doing an ordinary thing. Edward put his phone in his pocket and got out of the car. The prepared statement lasted 40 seconds. He read the first paragraph, the careful, lawyered, consequence-minimizing paragraph, and then he stopped, set the paper down, looked out at the room, shareholders, board members, journalists, cameras. Flora was standing at the back. He hadn't known she would be there. She wore charcoal gray and an expression that gave nothing away. He looked at her for just a moment. Then he told the truth. Not the corporate version. Not the version his lawyers would have approved. The actual truth, delivered in the flat, exhausted tone of a man who has finally stopped calculating the cost of honesty. He said he had abandoned his wife when she tried to protect him. He said he had failed his son in a way that no business recovery could offset. He said he had trusted Victor Kane, not because the evidence warranted it, but because loyalty to Victor had always been more comfortable than listening to Flora. He said the collapse of Hall Global was not a result of market conditions or external pressure. It was a result of the choices he had made and the ones he had refused to make. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of shock, exactly. The silence of people recalibrating. At the back of the room, something shifted in Flora's expression. Not forgiveness. It was too early for that, and she was too honest a person to perform it. But something. The first crack in 5 years of necessary distance. She saw him. The actual him. Not the billionaire. Not the man who had thrown her out. The man standing at a podium with no strategy left, offering the only thing he still had that was worth anything. He resigned at the end of the statement. Effective immediately. No negotiated exit package. No transitional role. Just a clean severance from the thing he had spent 15 years building and 6 months destroying. His lawyer was pale. The board chairman looked like a man witnessing a controlled demolition he hadn't authorized. Edward gathered his notes, the prepared statement he hadn't read, the truthful one he had, and walked out of the room. For the first time in 15 years, he had nothing. It was the most honest he had felt in longer than he could remember. Victor Kane was arrested on a Tuesday morning outside his apartment in Tribeca. Edward heard about it the same way everyone else did. A news alert on his phone, A photograph of Victor in a gray overcoat being guided into a federal vehicle with the particular indignity of a man who had spent years believing consequences were for other people. The evidence package that broke the case open had been assembled quietly, over several weeks, by a team of forensic accountants operating under instruction from Jones' strategic group. Flora had done it without telling him, without being asked, without attaching any condition to it whatsoever. His lawyer called to deliver the news. Edward sat in the kitchen of the modest apartment he was renting in Brooklyn. No views, no marble, nothing that announced anything about him, and listened, and said very little. When he hung up, he sat for a long time in the quiet. The woman he had betrayed had become the only person willing to save him. Not because he deserved it. He understood that clearly, because Flora Jones had apparently decided, somewhere along the way, that grace was not something you extended based on merit. You extended it because of who you were. He took Ethan to a baseball game on a Saturday in October. They took the subway because Ethan had requested it specifically, and Edward, who had not ridden the subway in 11 years, discovered it was considerably louder than he remembered. Ethan thought this was funny. Edward found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did too. They ate hot dogs that were structurally unsound. Ethan explained the infield fly rule with the authoritative patience of someone addressing a slow learner. Edward listened and asked questions, and didn't pretend to know things he didn't know, which felt like a new approach to most situations. After the game, over lunch at a diner, Ethan had chosen because they had chocolate milkshakes that came in a metal cup. Ethan reached into his backpack and produced a folded piece of paper, a drawing. Recent. The crayon lines were more controlled than the ones in the shoebox, the figures more recognizable. Two people at a baseball game. Tall one, small one, beneath it, in handwriting that was still finding itself. Me and Dad. October. Edward unfolded it carefully. He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. You drew this before today? He finally managed. Ethan shrugged, the elaborate nonchalance of a 9-year-old concealing something tender. I knew you'd come. The school winter concert was on a Thursday evening in December. Edward arrived early and found a seat near the back. Flora was already there, near the middle, and she turned when he entered. Not with surprise, because she had told him about the concert herself, 3 weeks ago, in a message that had been brief and factual, and which Edward had read approximately 40 times. She nodded at the empty seat beside her. He made his way down the row and sat. They didn't say much. There wasn't a language yet for what they were building. Too much history for easy warmth. Too much truth now visible for the old distance to hold. Something was growing in the space between those two things. It didn't have a name. It didn't need one yet. On the stage, Ethan appeared with his class, wearing a white shirt that was already slightly untucked, scanning the audience with the focused urgency of a child looking for specific faces. He found them, both of them, together. The expression that crossed his face was not dramatic. It was simply relief. The particular relief of a child who had carried a quiet hope for a very long time and was only now, finally, being allowed to set it down. He waved. They both waved back. It was not a healed family. Not yet, and perhaps not in the way that word is usually meant. There were years of absence that no baseball game or December concert could fully account for. There were conversations still unfinished, trust still being rebuilt one careful day at a time, a 9-year-old boy still learning what it meant to have a father who showed up. But they were in the same room, choosing, all three of them, to be in the same room. For now, Edward Hall had decided, that was everything. 5 years earlier, he had stood at a window and watched the most important people in his life disappear into a storm, and told himself it was the right decision. He understood now what it had actually been. The most expensive mistake of his life had never appeared on any balance sheet. It had walked out of his front door carrying a suitcase and a sleeping child. And the most remarkable thing, the thing that would stay with him longer than any of it, was that she had never stopped being worth more than everything he thought he was protecting. Neither had the boy who had drawn a picture of the two of them before the day had even happened. Because Ethan had always known his father would come back. He had simply been waiting for his father to know it too.